Hello and welcome to How to Fuck Up a Startup. We fucked up, so you don't have to. Steve's here.
You're right.
Yeah, how's it going?
Yeah, not bad. Not bad.
So I thought today's topic of conversation, because we've already been talking about it, so why not put some mics in front of us and do it completely unnaturally between us?
Oh, absolutely.
Talking about values that you embed, or the culture that you embed in a startup or a business.
Values.
Yeah. So I think the two different things, right? You know this about me anyway. I've always been a big believer that values and culture are very different, right? I think you can write down some values that mean very little. In fact, good example is a company that we used to work for together, who on numerous occasions over what were we there for, 3, 4, 5 years, consistently changed their values, wrote down different words on a bit of paper, in fact, I'm not sure if you remember this, but I did a leadership off-site with all of the vice presidents in the business to talk about and discuss what our values should be, blah, 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 blah. And actually, what is always really stark is the huge gap between what's written on a bit of paper and how employees feel about the business. And that particular business was going through layoffs, it was constantly changing, and we'd written down this set of values at a really bad time when actually we were going through that change process, and they just there was just a huge gap between what the values were and what they were actually implementing, right?
Constantly pushing a family ethos when people didn't really feel like they were part of a family. At work. I totally agree.
And that actually, in some respects, I think that can be more damaging because so as a leader, you're constantly right. You must have values, you must have a culture. So people artificially do that and go through that process. But actually, that's almost more damaging than if you'd said nothing.
Oh God, the word family has deep-seated emotional and relationshipal consequences and connotations. Right?
We like making up words on this podcast.
Totally.
What was that one? Relationshipable?
No. I've lost my train of thought now.
Sorry.
But it has these deep-seated emotional ties to it. And if you're laying off half your workforce and pushing the point that we're all a working family, it's completely at odds with the message, right?
Yeah.
The juice is not worth the squeeze.
Yeah, 100%.
So it kind of undermines your entire ethos from the word go, really. So no, we are not a working family. We are a team. There's a big difference between a team and a family. You can still have your teams back, and you're supposed to have your families back, right?
Yeah, 100%. And so thinking about what we were thinking about and how to write, and I'll be honest with you, I've struggled with this throughout my career, and I think we still are kind of struggling because it's very difficult to put down on paper what you mean by things, and what your values should be and what your culture should be. So one of the things that we wrote down, and one of the things we've been talking about, is this concept of embodying a servant leader kind of mindset. The very makes me cringe a little bit. The very saying of that sentence makes me cringe a little bit, just because it's been so overused. But let me tell you what I think it means, and then you tell me kind of what your input to that is, how you feel about it. So I think servant leader is about a mindset. It's about looking at the team and understanding that as the leader, CEO, whatever phrase we put on it, whatever title we put on it, that you're there to serve the rest of the team, right? So you're there to do what is needed to help them to be successful.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, totally. The way people don't like the word servant, I think has deep-seated connotations, but I think going into any leadership role, you should have it in the forefront of your mind that although you are there to make decisions, the compassion and the need to be able to adequately serve your team is really important, because they need to know that whatever they're going to be doing is for the greater good. They need to have that instilled confidence in your ability. And if you can't show them compassion or flexibility and things like that, then you're not really doing your job properly. I think I waffled a lot there.
No.
You're
absolutely right. Yeah, and it's also outside of just your team, right? So as we talked about it, we talked about things like the customers, the family, even wider society, which again is a bit flowery and makes me cringe a little bit. But, we're not trying to fucking change the world here, which is, again, something that I hate. But the concept of, serving that concept and being, I think a lot, particularly in bigger businesses as we work through them, there's so many different layers of mission or targets or whatever the phrase is that actually you lose sight of the bigger picture, which is that the whole team, however big it is, whether it's 5 people or 10,000 people, are all going after the same thing, and you all have to serve that higher purpose, and the values are designed to make you work in such a way that helps you to achieve that.
Absolutely, and they're values, but they're also like behaviors, right? They can't be so complicated and so obscure that they're instantly kind of put out of mind. They need to be really simple, really really achievable for everybody.
And down to like tactical level, I think what's really important, what I wanted to instill in these, and I don't think we're there yet, like it's a work in progress, but you want to instill it to a point, to your point, where every day, like every behavior that you're doing, you're thinking of that. So you're being able to recall that and go, look, am I acting in a way that is a servant leader mindset? Am I just out for myself here, or actually am I serving the team in a way that's going to help us all to be successful?
Absolutely. This could be massively overcomplicated with team objectives and things like that, but when it really comes down to the crunch, it's make sure what you are doing is not going to adversely impact anybody within 100%. Those boundaries, right?
Yeah, and then the second one we do, which actually brings us on nicely to it, is the other one that I've got noted down here from our conversations was own everything that you do.
Absolutely.
Like own it. Like let's spin this on its head then. You do it this way. You tell me what you think about everything, owning everything you do, and then I'll counter it.
This kind of comes into it comes into play with confidence as well, right? If you are in whatever position you're in, whatever your responsibilities are, you are ultimately going to have to make some decisions. Now, whether that's on the development of something, the implementation of something, the buying process, whatever, nobody's going to make the right decision every single time.
Yeah.
But firstly, you making that decision and having the balls to put yourself out there for a failure is commendable. But when that does happen, you need to be able to, bring it up. And it's something we've talked about a few times in the past, like, when you can see something going wrong, the fear of not telling anyone generally trumps it, right?
Yeah.
And that thing gets worse and worse and worse and compounded over time. And then all of a sudden, this thing that could have been really simple and small and insignificant way back when could have been like nipped off straight away.
And I think even just the concept of owning everything you do, we've talked about like an owner's mindset versus an employee's mindset. Like an employee's, I think we've talked about it. One of the only negative I can think about in my head right now about having a startup and being a founder, we've talked about this, is when you go on holiday, right? So you go on holiday and you're working for a big company and you're an employee. You go on holiday and you're like, out of office on, I'm done, like whatever happens will happen, and you go away and you forget about it. Now, as a startup founder, we don't do that. We can't do that because we're owners, right? So everything that we do, we know is inextricably linked to the success of that business. So you can go on holiday, but you're never really on holiday. Like you're always going to be checking your phone, you're always going to be looking at things, right? But I think that as a value and trying to instill that, particularly in an early team, is really important because you act in a different way if you're an owner of a business.
Absolutely.
You act in a completely different way if your actions are inextricably linked to the success of whatever that thing is. You act in I'm sure we can all think of times when we've been in bigger businesses where you're like, do you know what? I'll make that decision and who cares? Because actually, if I get it wrong, it's not going to have a huge impact.
Absolutely.
Whereas the small things at a startup have a huge ramification.
And that ultimately, what leads people to like choose startups as their kind of typical working environment because they kind of relish these sorts of challenges.
It's a mindset thing,
And it's always like every time, like in both the startups that I've worked in, I've noticed when you're hiring people, there is always this big sort of risk conversation. Like people believe it's a risky activity going into a startup.
Well, I would only counter that with, unless to your point, you've been in loads of startups before.
Yeah.
Hire from startups into startups is a bit different, but when you're coming from a big business, it definitely seen that way.
People, and face value, it can be a risk working in a startup because of all of these things that we've talked about. But actually, is your Are you really that secure in a big business? Really?
No. Yeah, you're right.
I mean, after the last, like, look at the tech layoffs in the US over the past year. God, they've been decimated. Like, you could have worked in a startup for a year and not been laid off, and actually something could come from it. I don't think it's as much of a risk as people think it is, personally.
Well, and also that comes back to that ownership mindset, because obviously I've harped on about the negatives of being a startup, but the real positives are that ownership. For someone who likes radical ownership, for someone who likes accountability, because personally, you know this, you've seen me throughout my career, one of the things I've struggled with is not enough accountability. Like, I don't like not being responsible for something. Like, I don't like the feeling in a big business that there's 20 other people that are doing that, right? I don't like that. What I prefer is
being deep.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm not going to use that phrase. Being not shallow into something that means that you own it, right? And I'm fine with taking on my shoulders that I'll make good and bad decisions. And I'd rather be in that position. And I think, like you say, recruiting people that have a similar kind of attitude, want to own something, want accountability is really, really important. Okay, third one that we wrote down was show up and be consistent.
I mean, that kind of goes into what we've just been talking about, right? If you're owning it, you're going to show up and being consistent.
Yeah, and I think what we talked about there was two things I've got noted down here from our conversations, which is, to demonstrate something is better than to speak it. Now, this is a really interesting one. So again, we've had tons of experience of people saying one thing and acting the other. Now, I would say this isn't just about startups. This isn't just about business. This is about life in general. Like, that integrity to be who you say you are and demonstrate the behaviors that you speak is one of the most fundamental pillars of trust, above and beyond everything else. It even comes back to that first point we made about servant leader mindset and saying something and then acting upon it and doing what you're saying you're doing, and having a value that says we've got a family, and as a family we never lay anyone off, and then laying off 10 people is massively detrimental, right? So having that and showing up and being consistent and people knowing how you're going to behave and act in a certain situation just builds trust. It fosters trust and just builds a much better culture. I
mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think it's really easy to get comfortable as an owner or a co-founder or a founder. You could be pushing fiscal responsibility to your staff, but and actually putting all sorts of stuff on your credit card
100%
that you shouldn't be.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't really describe it any better than that. I mean, that's
a very good example.
That's a very good example.
A very specific example, but very good. No, you're absolutely right. And then the other thing that we noted, which kind of goes hand in hand with that, exactly as you just said, like, behave as you expect others to behave. Like, absolutely. And I say this to my children. I mean, like, you think about bringing up children, you think about family, like providing a role model and behaving in a way that is consistent with what you're asking everyone else to behave in. Is absolutely helping to build that culture. And that's all the way to top. So something you mentioned earlier was like having the courage to speak to someone in a potentially more hierarchical position about something that's going wrong, or admitting a problem. All those things I think are fostered from that, which is that I feel comfortable telling someone I've messed up when I know that they're going to behave in a consistent way, when I know that they're going to understand that everyone does that, so, et cetera, et cetera.
And not paying lip service to it as a leader. When you hear it, I mean, it takes me back to the military. They'd always have these sessions with the sergeant major, if you will, the regimental sergeant major, where it was the other rank's opportunity to tell them when things are going wrong, and when things are like not making the rank and file happy.
Absolutely.
No one ever came up.
No,
with
of course it didn't.
Through fear. Fear. And actually, when people did come up with things, they were just beaten down, quite frankly. And that as a leader is kind of unforgivable in my opinion.
Well, I love that example, and it comes from the military. You're right. I've seen it a million times in the military, but then also, like, you see it in businesses all the time, don't you? You see, like, march someone into the office and go, right, give me some feedback on X. You're like, well, of course I'm not going to, because I respect everything that you're doing and you're the boss, so why would I counter that?
Having the courage and integrity to speak up when
absolutely
it needs to be done like it's really important.
And that's where the tiny
filter
details
through.
are important, right? Because if you bring something to me or one of our employees brings something to us and I immediately shoot it down, or do I go, I appreciate your feedback. Like, I like what you're saying there. That's interesting. Here's the reasoning I am or am not going to follow that path.
Absolutely.
Just massively changes the game, I think. Fourth one, before we run out of time, discuss then commit. So I'll give you my example of this, right? When the Iraq war kicked off, right? Do you remember? I know it's a while ago. It's a bit deep. Deep. I've used that word too much today. When the Iraq war kicked off, my example of this, right or wrong, no judgment here, but there was loads of protesting, right? Before we went into war with Iraq, before we went across the border, there was all the protests at home, everything was kicking off. Then the government committed to going. We went across the border, and still everyone protested. Still there was all the stuff in London. Still there was the kids being brought out of school to protest against the war in Iraq. It had happened, right? Again, no judgment, not saying right or wrong, but that for me is a really good analogy of discuss then commit, right? We discussed it. Everyone made their points heard. Everyone made their opinion heard, and then we were in. The decision had been made. Commit to it, right? And I think that's a geopolitical example, which is not the best, but the point is, it always takes my mind back to that as an analogy, which is, in a business, everyone should be heard. We've talked about that. We should behave in a consistent way. We should all be able to have our voices heard. But when we decide on a course of action, no matter whose course of action that is, everyone has to commit and go after
all
it.
in. Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, a half-assed or half-implemented whatever it is it's not the best situation, is it? You need to be committed completely in order to follow it through until fruition. And
back to this being a value, I think the problem from a personal perspective for each individual that's involved in that is the last thing you want to do is look back, even if it did fail, and say, I think that failed because I didn't put in enough work, or I think that failed because I didn't commit. Like, you don't want that attitude.
No, absolutely not.
And pointing the finger, pointing the blame, that's a big one, right? That comes down to this to some extent. I don't think we've got that explicitly linked, but,
If people, live up to the second one? Own everything.
Own everything you do,
yeah. If you own everything you do, the finger of blame doesn't need to be pointed per se.
Yeah.
There has to be a blame.
Yeah.
But it's how that blame is delivered and dealt with, etc. It's like, if you're empowering people to make decisions and own it when it's wrong, then it doesn't really... blame doesn't come into it. Unless it's a consistent thing, right? If somebody is consistently failing, then you've got something to look at.
Yeah.
But blame is blame. There is a place for blame, but it's just it's measured, right?
Yeah. And then my final one, which I actually, this is my favorite one. I like this. When you're on fire, stay humble. When you're struggling, stay hopeful. Yeah. And I think that just comes down. And another point to make about these values is that we can't all live them 100% of the time, right? We understand that. Everyone's human, right? Actually, it's a bit like I always say about policies in a business, right? They're guardrails.
Yeah.
Right? The idea is they're guardrails. And what they're designed to do is identify exceptions, right? So they're not designed to be absolute black and white rules. These are about behaviors and instilling them as best you can. And that one in particular, like stay humble when you're on fire, is so important. I've made that mistake. You get into a high flying position, you're like ego, like this is me. But everything changes, and when it does change, and it will, when you're in a position that's not quite so good, or your mental health suffering, or whatever it is, you're going to look back and go, shit, probably should have been nicer to that person.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Don't be a dick.
Don't be a dick is our favourite line. We haven't written it in here because we didn't know if it would translate into American, but it's definitely something that we live by and live with humility, which kind of backs that up. Final, I keep saying that. I've said, how many times I've said final one? 3 times? 4 times?
Something like that. Yeah.
Bring solutions first. Solutions, not
yeah.
problems.
God, yeah. Like, people that just come tell it. Like, if you've got a problem, work out what your solution is before coming to your boss and saying, I've got this problem. If you can come to your boss saying, I've got a problem, but this is how I'm going to deal with it, and you're just looking for, I don't know, a bit of affirmative, then that's way better than just coming and moaning about something that you can't deal with.
Yeah, 100%.
All the time.
And then I would flip it on its head. If you're the boss, don't come with a solution. Like, shut up and listen.
Yeah.
Right. So one of the things that I heard the other day, I can't remember what I was watching, listening to a podcast or watching something online, and it's about talking last in a meeting, right? And the power that can have. So like, if the employees are bringing solutions, that's fantastic. But if you're in a meeting, if you walk in as a boss, and I thought it was a really powerful analogy, you walk in as a boss, because I'm sure I've done it. You could probably tell me I've done this a million times. But you walk in and you go, right, here's what I think the answer is.
Yes.
What does everyone else think? Right?
Yes.
But it's an amazing thing, right? When you think about it, because you're walking in and going, right, here's what I think the answer is as the boss. Now you tell me what you think. And back to the yes man conversation. What's everyone going to say?
Well, I mean, if it was me, I'd probably say no, but most people would say yes.
Bullshit. They might pick that up. Yeah, but you're right. No, I know. And that's whereas if you go, here's the problem when you're addressing a room, what's everyone's thoughts on that? Even if you have got a preconceived idea of what the answer is.
Absolutely. I mean, why do you hire people? Why have you got employees if not to solutionize problems
100%.
for you, like whatever that problem may be?
If you can do it yourself, you'd be a solopreneur, right?
Yeah, solopreneur with no employees and probably no hair.
Yeah.
To be fair. Don't look at me.
Moving
like
on.
that. Don't look at me like that.
So let's finish it with this then. I think my favourite one is when you're on fire, stay humble. When you're struggling, stay hopeful. We'll keep working on these. These are never finished. I think another point to finally make is that Jesus Christ. Another point to make.
5 times.
Yeah, 5. And 1, 2. Another point to make is that these are all constantly evolving, right? I don't think our values now are going to be the same values we're going to need in 3-4 years' time.
Absolutely not.
So they're always going to be changing and evolving. But well, thanks for joining us on how to fuck up a startup.
You always thank me for joining. Like,
I wasn't thanking you. I was thanking the people.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
I couldn't give
Carry
a
on.
shit if you were here or not.
Thanks for joining, everyone.
Thanks for joining. This has been how to fuck up a startup. Steve's fucked up, so you don't have to.
You're a douche.